Hey guys, this is Mr. Moore, and I'm back with you for our AP European History Review. This series of videos has been created by me to help enhance the studying and reviewing that you've already done throughout the year. The College Board has given us a detailed study guide. They're called Key Concepts, and I'm using that to kind of guide some discussion. I'm going to use some visual aids, Google Maps, maybe even Google up some things for you to see in an effort to try to help you understand the content that you need to know to be prepped for the AP test. At the end of the year here, these video review sessions, I hope, will enhance the learning that you're doing on your own. If at any time you want to stop and slow down and just go read through the material yourself, you're always welcome to do that. It's provided on my website. And I'm going to go ahead and dive in. This is topic 1.6. Remember that Unit 1 covers the Renaissance and exploration from about 1450 to 1648. And we're going to dive into this topic of technological advances and the age of exploration. This is a good time to remind you that the AP course has 7 themes. These 7 themes, I'm going to scroll down here to the bottom of this Unit 1 on all of the unit key concept outlines that I have given to you. It gives you a reminder of the 7 thematic focuses that are covered throughout the entire course of this year. And they range from things like geography, interactions of Europe and the world, to economic conditions, economic and commercial developments. We also are always constantly looking at the cultural and intellectual developments like philosophical ideas and religious trends. We're looking at government, states and other institutions of power. That would be government and other institutions like the church. And again, if I ever say the church, I mean the Catholic Church. Social organization and development, those are things that they love on the AP test. Marriage patterns, family organization, demographics, where people move to and trends, socioeconomic status, that kind of stuff would all be under the social organization and development. National and European identity, going from these feudal states in medieval times up to the European Union and even the country of Great Britain exiting the European Union currently right now. Technological and scientific innovation, seeing how things develop and grow over time. Just remember that the world that we live in with electricity and combustible engines like in cars and jet engine airplanes and all of the things that we think about, like having a cell phone with internet connection, and even being able to watch this review on YouTube, we have to remember how things have technologically advanced over time. And that's where this one starts off. This 1.6 is going to start us off with this whole age of exploration, but it's going to start talking about technological advances and how technology allows people to go exploring the world that they live in. And it's going to change the way that they see the world. They're going to go from a medieval, dark age, middle age mentality through the Renaissance and up to the Enlightenment. They're going to be shaping and changing. And eventually we're going to talk about the scientific revolution in a further unit and the Enlightenment in a further unit. But this is laying the groundwork for those things. So learning objective G, explain the technological factors that facilitated European exploration and expansion, advances in navigation, cartography, and military technology enabled Europeans to establish overseas colonies and empires. I'm going to make reference to 2 sets of notes from my class. Week 5, if you go on my website under Week 5, European exploration, and even Week 12, when I talked about European empires in the Americas. The first thing it talks about right here is the technology. So I'm going to jump down here to the end of my notes where I talk about technology and how that's going to affect European colonization. There's different kinds of things that one could look at. One of the first and obvious things is map making, cartography and map making. This is an old school map that's actually pretty good because it actually shows North and South America, and it shows a rough estimate of Africa, Asia, and of course Europe. It's not very much to scale. It's not like what we have today. I mean, we are so blessed to be able to have, what a beautiful thing to have Google Maps, and we can have an understanding of cartography, seeing the map as a three-dimensional object, seeing where country boundaries are, where cities are, and being able to zoom in and even do street views. You can go on a virtual tour of the world with Google Earth or Google Maps. And this was not the kind of cartography that people had back in the 1400s. When this class starts in 1450, it's right when people are starting to break out of Europe and starting to expand their views of the world. Some of the countries that heavily get involved in exploration would be obvious, like Portugal is one of the first to go out and explore because they're on the very edge of Europe. It's a sea country by nature. So the Portuguese are exploring Africa, and they've had trade with Africa for years. But they start to stretch even further and go down and around into these countries of West Africa, which back in the day would have been kingdoms, like the Kingdom of Mali and Timbuktu and other places. They even started to branch out into the Atlantic. There is a chain of islands in the middle of the Atlantic out here called the Azores. They branched that far. It's quite far away from, the ports of Portugal, and they started finding things like Cape Verde and the Canary Islands, and the Spanish are also right on their tails doing some of this exploration, and they're being engaged with countries across Africa. And one of the things that allowed them to do that was better map making. So cartography is map making. Old school medieval maps were sometimes called TO maps because they saw the world. If you just take this and you turn it on its side, you could see Asia over here and Europe here and Africa here. So most maps that we make in the world today are north oriented. And that's just the way we think of the world. When I look at this map right here, we almost think that north is up, but that's not true. That's just the way we make our maps. Our Earth is a sphere that's floating free in space. So there is not really an up or down as far as north and south. But in the modern world, we make all of our maps with a north orientation. I remember taking a geography class in college and looking at some maps that were not made with north being at the top of the map, and it kind of threw me off, and I realized that's a very cultural, modern thing that we do. This is more of a north-oriented TO map from medieval times, again, Europe, Africa, and Asia. So simplistic. There's no trying to even get the right shapes or anything, but it would always put Jerusalem at the heart of the map. The center of European culture and ideology was Christianity. And so that's what these old TO maps were about. There's some other inventions like better ships, the caravel, and these were ships that were much larger than old medieval vessels. The Portuguese, of course, leading the way, the Spanish, and also the Dutch. They're really some of the masters of seafaring and trade. Things like the compass were originated over in China, and they made their way over to Europe through land trade through the Ottoman Empire. So China is kind of the center of a lot of great inventions, like, well, good and bad inventions, like gunpowder. Originally was used in China for fireworks and celebration, right? And even some people tried it for medicinal purposes. But then those ideas slowly made their way through trade routes, through India, through the Arabian trade routes, and then into Europe. So gunpowder, and of course the magnetic compass was used by Arabs for a long time before they were used by Europeans. So more accurate, like the compass, and also better ships, and there's all kinds of instruments that are used, and astrolabe is an instrument that's used to chart stars. This works really good if you know the star systems where you live. And people, of course, didn't have any kind of technology, so they would use things like lunar cycles and charting where the stars are to help navigate and make sure that they could tell where they were on the planet Earth. And the astrolabe is an instrument that, and in star charts, to be able to calculate where you are. That doesn't work very good if it's a cloudy day. And of course, it certainly doesn't work good during the day to use star charts and such. But there was other instruments later that are developed, like the sextant, which is an instrument that you can use to look out over the horizon and see the curvature of the Earth while you're on the ocean. The ocean is the one place where you can kind of tell that you're living on a sphere. When you're on land, there's mountains and valleys, and you can't really tell that you're living on a sphere. But when you're out on the flat ocean, it turns out that our planet isn't flat, and you can tell that there's a curvature by looking great distances out into the ocean. So these are some of the things, technology that was allowing Europeans to go over and to establish colonies overseas. I'd like to take just a second and remind you about the 5 really dominant countries that were colonizing and then later setting up empires overseas. During the 14 and 1500s, the Portuguese set up a giant trading empire around the globe. And you can see that they set up ports throughout Asia, all across Africa, and even into the Americas once the Americas were discovered. Brazil is the largest Portuguese-speaking country on the world. There are more people who speak Portuguese in Brazil than in Portugal. Angola and Mozambique in Africa are also Portuguese-speaking countries. But you can see it was much more of a trade empire, whereas Spain, at about the same time, is going to create what they call a colonial empire. They are involved in trade, but the difference is the Spanish go in and actually take over. Almost all of the Americas were taken over by Spain during time. So you can see from this little map reminder, again, about the same time, and there was stiff competition between the two, the Portuguese and the Spanish. And you can see what a vast piece of the Americas the Spanish take over, and they bring with them their culture, their religion, and some of their problems and diseases, and that's going to create a whole bunch of issues. The other place that Spain took over, of course, was the Philippines, and that's going to play a role later on. The Dutch are another one of these trading empires. You can see that they don't take over a ton of territory, but they set up trading ports everywhere. And during the 1600s, the Dutch are at the top of their game. They're the most wealthy and powerful, really, power in Europe during the 1600s. Like Amsterdam, the nominal capital of the Netherlands. I'm going to zoom in here on the Netherlands just for a second. Amsterdam's probably the most famous city, and during the 1600s was the richest city on the planet Earth, Amsterdam. It's a beautiful city today. It's full of canals, and it's still a very wealthy place. But during the 1600s, it's where the first stock markets were created. And if you'll remember that whole tulip mania, where people were buying and selling at the margins, and stock markets rose and crashed and fell, and it was pretty amazing. So that's just a little look at those first empires. The other two we have to pay attention to come later in the game. And so we're not really ready to talk about these, but since we're talking about overseas empires. It's the French and the English. And as you can clearly see in class, we tried to teach you that this is more during the 17 and 1800s when the French and the British are at the top of their game. It's really the Portuguese and the Spanish during the 14 and 1500s. Then the Dutch hit their peak in the 1600s. And during the 17 and 1800s, it's the French and the British. And that's an oversimplification for sure. But at least it kind of gives you a little a reminder of how much territory the French took over by the end. And of course, the masters of this entire class, the British Empire, as the saying goes, the sun never set on the British Empire, meaning that at some point it was always day on British territory around the world somewhere because of the vast amounts of territory that the British controlled. So that again kind of shows you a good solid answer to this objective, this learning objective G, explaining the technological factors that facilitated European exploration and expansion. Okay, and there's a lot of other things that could be discussed and talked about, but I'm going to move on to learning objective H. Explain the motives for and effects of European exploration and expansion during, from the time of 1450 to 1648. This first bullet point says European states sought direct access to gold, spices, and luxury goods to enhance personal wealth and state power. While I was teaching my classes about this whole era of exploration, I tried to remind them of the 3 G's that would happen. And this slide right here I used to try to show how Europeans were branching out around the globe for 3 basic reasons: God, gold, and glory. Christianity. There was a lot of people who legitimately wanted to spread their Christian faith around the world. And so the places that they took over, the places that they went and explored, they wanted to save people's souls. And there's also a political motive behind it. Some people were authentically just trying to spread Christianity, but there's also a lot of people who were trying to enhance their own political power, because if people are Christian, then thus the political influence of the Pope is expanded, if you can kind of see that. So there are some authentic people who just want to save people's souls and spread Christianity, but there's also the other side of the scope, that if people believe in Christianity and you're a Christian leader, thus you have more control over the people that you conquer. And that's very Machiavellian. As you'll remember from our discussion of Machiavelli, it would be wise for a leader who is over a Christian people to play the part of a Christian, whether he is or not. So that's the God part. The gold part is not just literally finding gold. That was something. I mean, how many Europeans left Europe and came over to the New World literally looking for El Dorado, this famous gold city that people thought existed in the Americas? So some of them actually did literally come over looking for gold. In South America, they found full mountains of silver. So it was kind of amazing how valuable metals were easily extracted from the Americas once they enslaved the indigenous population, which is a horrific piece of the puzzle, but definitely something that Europeans were doing. The other part of the gold is not like literal gold, but setting up cash crops, plantations in the New World. Tobacco was one of the number one, products coming out of North America. And the great thing about tobacco is that once somebody gets addicted to it, you're going to get a return customer forever. It's great for the person selling it, and it's horrible for the person using it, because of course that person's going to eventually get cancer and die of a slow, horrible death. But it's a cash crop. There's money there. In the Caribbean, and maybe I'll jump over here to Google Maps and give you a little look at what I'm talking about. When I say the Caribbean, I'm talking about the modern countries of Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and these what they call the Lesser Antilles down here. This is the sugar zone. The Caribbean was all about sugar. It was the most valuable crop coming out of the Caribbean. There was also coffee, is a major cash crop that was coming out of the Americas. But sugar, everybody's got a sweet tooth, and even today, sugar dominates the food industry. And so when I say God, gold, and glory, when I'm talking about the gold part, it's not just physical gold, but that ability to make money. And so the glory part is that part that's hard to quantify academically, but that desire of countries to spread their political ambition, their sphere of influence, their ability to project their power, kind of gives them prestige. Prestige is a word that's not hard to understand, but it is kind of hard to academically quantify how do you gain prestige. And it turns out that European countries, the more territories they controlled overseas, right, then the more wealth they could extract from those overseas colonies. And thus, that's why the British, by the end of the 1800s, was the richest country on the planet Earth. By the end of the 1800s, there was more wealth in the banks of Great Britain than the rest of the world combined. And so that just kind of gives you a little bit of a perspective on that. So, the rise of mercantilism gave the state a new role in promoting commercial developments and the acquisition of colonies overseas. I think this word right here, mercantilism, is a word that we have to spend some time talking about. I chose to focus on the concept of mercantilism later in class, economically. So I'm going to refer to you. This is under week 12, European Empires in the Americas. I dealt with mercantilism, reminding students it's an economic system to make the home country rich through exclusive trade with its colonies. So the government is controlling the economy. And mercantilist empires are trying to accumulate gold. Gold was often boiled down into blocks called bullion, and they would use that to easily transport it across, or the silver pesos, the pesos de ocho, those pieces of 8 that you might have heard about in like pirate movies. So mercantilism is you want to have more exports, so you're making money. If I'm exporting things as a country, if I'm exporting goods out, then I'm bringing money in, right? Whereas the opposite is true. If I'm importing stuff, then that means I'm exporting my money. My money's going somewhere else. And so you want to, if you're a mercantilist country, you want to continually accumulate precious metals. That's the whole point of mercantilism. And so that was one of the driving economic ideas during this time period. The idea of capitalism is going to come later on. And we'll deal with that later on in this review. This next bullet point says Christianity was a stimulus for exploration as governments and religious authorities sought to spread the faith, and for some, it served as a justification for the subjugation of indigenous civilizations. So, unfortunately, Europeans, to a huge extent, as they were going and taking over places, they would often subjugate Native Americans. I tried to remind students of the horror that happened when Europeans showed up in the New World. And sometimes, as Americans, we like to look at other people as the bad guys and us as the good guys. But what was done to the Native American population by Europeans as they came in is pretty staggering. I'll remind you that there was 3 dominant civilizations when the Europeans showed up. There's the Aztecs in central Mexico, the Maya in Central America, and the Inca in South America. And in the United States, there was hundreds of different tribes living here in Apple Valley, California. Almost every street in Apple Valley is named after some of the Native American tribes. So in our own community, in our own high school is on Navajo Road, of course reminding us of those Native Americans But there's horrific things that were done to the Native Americans, those indigenous peoples. That's what it says right there. And sometimes people would use Christianity to say, "Hey, look, we have what these savages need for salvation." That might sound very racist. It was, okay? So that was one of those driving things. There's illustrative examples of the period. Underneath each one of these topics, they're going to give you examples. Again, these are examples that you might want to use in your writing. When you're asked to make a claim and then provide evidence and then tie it together with reasoning, these are some of the things that you might want to use as your evidence. As a reminder, the compass was invented in China during the Han Dynasty. The technology slowly made its way to Europe, where it's used for maritime navigation. We kind of already covered that a little bit, so I'll go on. The stern post rudder greatly increased maneuverability, allowing ships to take advantage of improved sail power by moving to contrary wind. Anybody could make a sail to capture wind and propel a ship forward. But what's really weird is with the new designs in sails and allowing the sail to swivel back and forth, you could actually use wind that's blowing against you to help you move forward. I know it sounds weird, but right now in my mind, I'm having this vision of when I was in college, I went on a trip to Egypt. And for 3 days, I sailed down the Nile River on a felucca, a small little ship down the Nile River. And the weird thing about the Nile River is it flows north. Again, we always think of north as up, but it's not. So the river actually flows to the north, okay? And so you think you could just take a boat and then you could just sail down the Nile, no problem. But the problem is a lot of the winds blow this direction, so it goes contrary to the direction you want to sail. And so these sailboats, these feluccas on the Nile River, would use this sort of sail technology to cut the wind so that they could actually use the wind to propel them down the river at a quicker pace. And coming up the river you think would be even slower, but because the prevailing winds are blowing this direction, they actually could go upriver pretty quick. So that sounds counterintuitive, but stern post rudders and sail technology really changed a lot of things. And again, I'll remind you that I did have a couple of slides here at the end that kind of show you some of the new sail technology, and I don't want to go into too much more of it than that. But the Portolanti, this is a descriptive map used in Middle Ages, giving sailing directions and providing charts showing the location of ports and various coastal features. So this would kind of tie us back into that idea of cartography and map making. And if you could show where dangers were or ports that were friendly to go resupply at, then you would be able to navigate the ancient world in a much better way. The quadrant and astrolabe instruments used to measure the inclined position in the sky of celestial body during day or night to calculate various readings such as longitude and latitude and time of day. Astrolabes were later replaced by sextants to help mariners navigate at sea. As we discussed again before, and I don't want to spend a ton of time on this right here, but if you want to Google this later on, latitude and longitude, those are things that develop slowly over time. Latitude are the lines that allow us to be able, like rungs of a ladder, they allow us to determine how far north or how far south we are of a center line that we have called the equator. That's an arbitrary, imaginary line that we've created as human beings to be able to tell where we are on a spherical planet that floats in the middle of space, right? So the equator is that center line of latitude. And the longitudinal lines that run from the north to the south, they actually measure east to west. And weird enough, it's impossible really to tell if the Earth is rotating on its axis like this. There's no way to determine where east or west is. And so the ones who take over the world, the Europeans who take over the world, they're the ones who get to choose the line between east and west. And that line's going to run right through London eventually. It's called the Prime Meridian. On the opposite side of the planet Earth, from the Prime Meridian, is this line here. It's not a straight line because it's a cultural line. It's a political line as well. It's called the International Date Line, and it's the exact opposite side of the planet Earth from the Prime Meridian in London. All time on the planet Earth is kept on London time because they're the ones who become the masters of the world. And so this is the beginning of keeping track of latitude and longitude and time of day and all of those kind of things. I think I pointed this out in class, but if you go to your Google Calendar and go under the settings, it will show you. I can just do it real quick to show you how much London still controls date and time on the planet Earth. If you go to your settings and you want to set the time format right here, where it says time zone. See how it says GMT? That's Greenwich Mean Time. So everything on the planet Earth is all kept Greenwich Mean Time, plus or minus, depending on where you live. See, it's plus or minus Greenwich Mean Time because of that Prime Meridian and the beginnings of this whole latitude and longitude and keeping track of those things. A Lantine rig is a triangular cell that became the favorite cell of the Age of Discovery, mainly because it allows a boat to tack against the wind, as was mentioned up here a few minutes ago. The stern post rudder, a rudder is actually that piece of the ship. You can see this piece that keeps it steady in the water. And then those cells allow it to rig against the wind as long as you can cut into the water, and allows you to go against the wind. Because capturing the wind to go with the wind is easy. It's capturing the wind to go against it that's hard. Anyways, military technology, especially guns and gunpowder, invented in China and used in the Middle East. Europeans greatly improved gun and artillery technology. People used it. The Spanish used it at the end of the Reconquista when they attacked the Muslim city of Granada, as was discussed in an earlier review. It was one of the first places where they were using some of that gunpowder to effect in the 1400s, driving the Muslims out of Europe. And gunpowder is going to become absolutely key to everything that's done in Europe during these 1400s. So if you're wondering, when did they start using gunpowder? Think to yourself, 1400s, 1500s, etc. They're going to continually improve that. States seek access to luxury goods. Spanish in the New World, conquistadors like Cortez defeating the Aztecs and Francisco Pizarro defeating the Inca gained vast territory in the Americas for Spain, or for the Spanish. El Dorado, the legendary city of gold, was never discovered, but silver from the Americas made Spain rich. The Spanish milled dollar, or pieces of 8, right? The piece of 8, the Riel de Ocho, became the most widely used currency in the world. The Spanish dollar was literally used as currency even in the United States until the middle of the 1800s. Long after we became a country, we were still using the Spanish mill dollar as a currency from around the world. If you wonder what that word milled means, take out a quarter, and if you feel the edges of a quarter, you'll notice that it's bumpy on the edge of the quarter. That's a milled coin, and the reason that they mill a coin is so that people can't shave off part of the coin. If these coins were being made out of gold or silver, and that's valuable metal, so some people would scrape off part of the gold or the silver, and then use the coin to trade, and then slowly over time they would amass a little stash of, gold or silver shavings. But the Spanish started to mill their coins so you couldn't shave off the edges of it. So the Spanish in the New World, and they defeated, and I kind of pointed out where the Aztecs and where the Inca were. The Portuguese in the Indian Ocean, a Portuguese sailor named Bartolomeu Diaz Our Bartholomew Diaz was the first to prove it was possible to sail around Africa, soon followed by another Portuguese sailor, Vasco da Gama, who successfully made a trip around the Cape of Good Hope to India and returned to Europe, making Portugal an early European master of Indian Ocean trade. I'm going to come here to back to my notes just to give you a little visual representation of everything that we're talking about. I'm going to blow this up so it's maybe a little easier to see on your screen. But this right here reminds us of some of the famous early explorers and kind of showing and charting some of their routes. This browned out area right here is parts that were not explored. The parts in yellow are pretty relatively known by Europeans by the end of the 1500s. So remember that this was Diaz who proved it was possible to make it around Africa. He made it to the end of Africa, proving it was possible. And then later, Da Gama actually does go over to Asia and return. Remember that Christopher Columbus was not trying to make it to the Americas. He's trying to get access to Asian goods, to the Indies. These islands right here are the East Indies. But he ends up in what's going to be called the West Indies. And we got Cortez, we got Pizarro. There's a ton of other ones that we did and didn't talk about some of them, but trying to keep it in a way that where we can manage the information to the best of our ability. So that's the Portuguese. The Dutch in the East Indies, and if you'll notice, if we looked at some of these maps where these countries were controlling, you'll notice that the Portuguese really controlled the Indian Ocean, the Indies, and the Spanish are going to control the Atlantic when it really comes down to it. So that's one of the things that it's trying to point out right here. But the Dutch are master shipbuilders and sailors. They set up a trade network around the globe, but didn't take over a lot of territory. Their biggest territorial claims were in the East Indies, known today as Indonesia. So on our map of the world, these islands down here that I've referred to several times as the East Indies, today is called Indonesia, and the Dutch literally took this area over. And that was the one territorial claim that they took over. You can see it right here in green. They did also set up tons of settlements down in South Africa, and the Dutch people are going to live so long in Africa that they're going to actually call themselves Africans. So if you hear somebody call themselves an Afrikaner, that's a white Dutch settler, or whose ancestors were these Dutch settlers in South Africa. So a ton of white Dutch people settle, and they set up farms down there. And later in history, we're going to talk about the Boers, those Dutch farmers down there. A couple more things here as we wrap up this topic right here. Mercantilist policies employed by the state. Remember that mercantilism is an economic system controlled by the state, controlled by the government. And at this time, the government is a king or queen, a monarch, if you will. There are really, during this time period, not many republics. There are a couple, down in Italy, there are some, but not really very many in Europe or around the world. We're starting to get into, again, this is covering the Renaissance and exploration, but this guy, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, was Louis XIV's finance minister, who was seen as a prime example of mercantilism, a national economic policy designed to maximize the trade of a nation and to maximize the accumulation of gold and silver, to maximize trade and to maximize the accumulation of gold and silver. And this last bullet point right here, religion and exploration, Jesuit activities. When we talked about the Reformation, we talked about something also called the Counter-Reformation. And that's actually going to be Unit 2. I'm going to review the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. But if you're reviewing for the AP test, I hope these things are already, solid in your head. And you'll remember the Jesuits. This is a group of Catholics who are like hardcore Catholics, completely devoted to the Pope. And they're going to use an almost militaristic sense of duty to the Pope. So I'll go ahead and read this and discuss it if needed. The Jesuits, or the Society of Jesus, were super loyal Catholics who wanted to revitalize the Catholic Church during and after the Counter-Reformation. They lived by a strict, almost militaristic order and were very missionary-minded, traveling the world to find or make converts, and specifically to Catholicism. Okay, they're hardcore Catholics, and that kind of helps you see one of the motivations for people as they're going out and exploring the world. Guys, I hope this is helping you out. Again, at any time, if you need to pause this video, rewind it, pause it, go look up something on Google, or pause it and just read through what's written from this official AP study guide, the key concepts. That's great. We'll come back then later and finish up the next section. Thanks for joining me.